completely disappeared for a wide variety of Arab states, which have decided, guess what? The Jews aren't our enemy. Iran is our enemy. And so this is how you ended up with the Abraham Accords, where the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, all of which have been supportive of these various wars of extinction against the Jewish state, have now decided that they're going to form a quite warm peace with Israel and recognize Israel's existence. That fundamentally changed the math on the ground. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is trying to walk that back by attempting to provide support to the radicalized Palestinian government of Fatah or of the Hamas or of Islamic Jihad. Alrighty, so let's talk about what exactly happened in the last couple of months that resulted in this round of new violence. Why don't we begin with the Abraham Accords? The Abraham Accords were this monumental shift in how people thought about the Middle East. So for decades, the conventional wisdom is there will not be peace between Israel and all these surrounding Arab states. It's the reason they call it the Israeli-Arab conflict as opposed to Israel versus the Palestinians, because it was supposed to implicate all of these various countries because of the three no's of Khartoum. Right? The idea was that until Israel made some sort of deal with the Palestinians, there would never be peace in the region, ever. No one could ever recognize the presence of Israel until Israel made concessions to the Palestinians. And so under that impression, Israel kept being like, okay, we'll make this concession and this concession and this concession. And the Palestinians kept being like, well, okay, we'll take those concessions, and also we're not going to do any of the things that you want us to do. So this was completely exploded by the Trump administration and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and mostly, ironically, by Barack Obama. So during the Obama administration, there was a real shift in how the United States treated Iran. So Iran has been threatening Israeli extinction since the Iranian Revolution of '79. They've constantly been shouting death to the Jews, death to America, destroy the Zionist entity. This has been part of their pitch for a very long time. And now they were developing nuclear weapons. And so Barack Obama had this bizarre vision of the Middle East in which the United States would be able to minimize its presence by essentially setting up Iran as a counterbalance to Saudi Arabia. They would create this realpolitik situation in which Iran had been newly moderated in some bizarre way, and they'd pushed off the nuclear agenda just long enough to get those moderates in power, and then they would be welcomed into the family of nations, and there would be this sort of balance of power between the Sunni and the Shia in the Middle East, and this would solve all problems. This was Barack Obama's new idea. It was a terrible idea because, as it turns out, there are no moderates in the government of Iran. It is run by the mullahs. This whole fake notion that the moderates were going to be emboldened by U.S. concessions was complete crap. So the Iranians continue in secret to foster their nuclear development. The Iranians take all the money that the United States is now allowing Iran to receive and spreading terrorism all over the region. So if we had a bigger map of the Middle East, what you would see is that down at the tip of Saudi Arabia is Yemen. And so there's a proxy war going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen. The Houthis, which are an Iranian-backed terrorist group, are fighting Saudi-backed groups in Yemen, and it's led to tremendous death. The United States had basically, under Barack Obama, moved away from alliances with both Israel and with Saudi Arabia and had moved toward this sort of bizarre warmth with Iran, which is a state that wishes fully to destroy both Saudi Arabia and Israel. Well, this forced Saudi Arabia into saying, wait a second, our enemies here are not the Jews. The Jews don't care about us, right? The Jews are not bothering us. The Jews don't want anything from us. The Jews just want to live there. And here we have this Iranian state that's actually trying to blow up like our oil resources and destroy our country. And what would be awesome is if we could form some sort of kind of covert alliance. And so all of the Saudi sort of proxy states, including the UAE and Bahrain and all the other Sunni states in the region, decided, wait a second, our enemy is not the Jews. Right? Our enemy is the Iranians. And so they started fostering relations in kind of covert ways with the Israelis, to the point where even during the Obama administration, there was talk about how Israel might use Saudi Arabian airspace in order to strike at Iran, which is located over here on the map. There's all this kind of new ties that are being forged. The new Egyptian regime, which is a regime that had been Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood took over after the Arab Spring that was much vaunted. It was supposed to heal the world in all of this. Really didn't. The Muslim Brotherhood was ousted. General al-Sisi took over in Egypt. He's been much friendlier with Israel. The Saudis have been much friendlier with Israel. Then along comes the Trump administration, and they decide they're going to turn decades of conventional wisdom about the Israeli-Palestinian issue and its centrality on their head. So the idea was, if you can force Israel into making enough concessions, and if you can just stop them from saying that they like Jerusalem and they want to keep Jerusalem, if you can just stop them from doing all this, maybe you will wheedle the entire Muslim world into accepting Israel's presence. The Trump administration comes along like, nah, this is nonsense. Okay, so we can see these burgeoning ties between Israel and these Arab countries. The Palestinian issue is a completely different issue. It's completely separate. So instead, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make very clear to everybody that we actually back Israel's right to exist, and we back Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, and we back Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. We're going to take those off the table. The Arabs no longer have a right to expect that Israel is going to give that stuff up, because we say that we're not going to push them on that. And we are going to foster ties between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And shock of shocks, it turns out that all these Arab nations decide our enemy ain't the Jews, our enemy is the Iranians. And so we really should foster ties with these folks and create this sort of new regional security bloc. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, Joe Biden takes over, and Joe Biden decides, come on, man. And he says, we're going to ditch all of the progress that was just made. We're going to pretend the Abraham Accords never happened, and we're going to start making overtures to Iran. Simultaneously, we are going to undo another Trump administration policy. So the Trump administration made very clear, we are not going to pretend that we are honest brokers between Israel and a bunch of terrorist groups. Instead, we are just going to make clear our support for Israel, and we're going to withdraw funding from, for example, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and the UNRWA and Hamas. We're just going to take away the funding from these various organizations. Biden comes in and he says, I'm going to restore the status quo ante. I'm going to try and get back into the Iran deal and allow Iran to foster terrorism with U.S. taxpayer dollars and with us allowing money to flow into Iran. I'm going to restore aid to all of these Palestinian terror groups. And so the Palestinians are like, okay, I guess now's a good time to push. And the Iranians are saying, okay, now's a good time for us to push because we have an administration in power that obviously is not pro-Saudi, that is obviously not pro-Israel. So if we push a little bit, we'll see kind of where exactly, how far we can push here. Factor number 2 is that the Palestinian Authority has not held an election since 2006. Mahmoud Abbas was last elected in 2005. He is now in the 16th year of a 4-year term. So when people talk about Israel as undemocratic and apartheid, 20% of Israel is Arab. There are Arabs who sit on the Supreme Court. There's a major Arab party called Ra'am, which is part of the Israeli Knesset. It's just a lie that Israel is an apartheid state. The true apartheid state is the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. 0 Jews live there, and they've not held an election in any of these areas for nearly 2 decades. So Abbas, in an attempt to appease the Biden administration and the incoming Democratic power base in the United States and the international community, he wants to show that he's legit. We're going to hold an election, says Mahmoud Abbas, who's I believe 80 years old. It turns out nobody likes Mahmoud Abbas. So Hamas looked like it was about to take over not just the Gaza Strip, but also the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And so like a couple of weeks before the election, Abbas was like, you know what? Bad idea, no elections. And knowing that this was going to set off a conflagration, Abbas starts pushing violence against Israel. The Fatah, who control all television in the West Bank, they start putting out videos about how it's good if you can kill a Jew. They start really ramping up a lot of the anti-Israel rhetoric. There are a bunch of incidents in which TikTok videos are taken of Palestinian youths in Jerusalem beating up Jews, and these are being celebrated. So there are a couple of pretexts that are used in order to redirect from I'm canceling the election to it's all the Israelis' fault. So in the it's all the Israelis' fault category, there are particularly 2 issues that they've been pushing. One is that the Palestinians were barred from entry via the Damascus Gate, which is a gate into Jerusalem, entry to the Temple Mount. Now, there were some roadblocks placed there because Israel was afraid that people were going to congregate and riot, which they promptly did as soon as Israel removed the roadblocks. So Israel removed the roadblocks, people congregated, they rioted, they did violence. Okay, this was used as a pretext to say that Israel was restricting access to the Temple Mount. I've been to the Temple Mount. Muslims have full and free reign over the Temple Mount. The Islamic Waqf controls the Temple Mount. They have since 1967. Israel won back all of the old city of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. And Moshe Dayan, who was the general of the Israeli army at the time, he handed over the keys to the Temple Mount to the Islamic Waqf. And so Jews are not allowed to pray openly on the Temple Mount right now, which is insane. The Muslims complained that on the one hand, worship wasn't being allowed there. Not true. 100% not true. During the middle of this chaos, by the way, 100,000 Muslims went up there during Ramadan, at the end of Ramadan, to pray on the Temple Mount. Doesn't sound like very good restriction of religious rights there. Okay, so a bunch of Fatah and Hamas members take over Al-Aqsa Mosque. They bring in rocks from the surrounding area. They bring in projectiles. They start throwing them at police. They put Hamas flags on the top of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a terrorist group, a genocidal terrorist group. They start attacking the Israeli police. When the Israeli police go and shut it down, then they say, oh, Israel is being aggressive in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's why we need to start firing missiles. Okay, that is reason number 1. It's a pretext and it's a lie. Reason number 2 is this long-standing legal dispute over an area of Jerusalem known as Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is sort of an outskirt of Jerusalem. It's a little suburb. It's known by Jews as Shimon HaTzadik. It's known by Arabs as Sheikh Jarrah. Okay, so in the 1870s, there were a bunch of Jews who arrived in this area of Jerusalem, and they bought up a bunch of plots of land in Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik is a Talmudic era sage, and so his grave is supposed to be there. So Jews bought a lot of the territory that are right around. They have all the legal land bills and all of that. Heavy Jewish population in Sheikh Jarrah up until the 1948 war. The 1948 war happens, and as mentioned, Jordan takes over this entire arena, including the old city of Jerusalem. And they proceed to put barbed wire there, and Jews aren't allowed in, no freedom of worship, the whole deal. During that time, the Jordanian government hands over to some people in Sheikh Jarrah legal title to those homes. So say, we took this over, here's a title, you own the home now. Some people, they didn't give legal title. For whatever reason, it got caught up in the bureaucracy, or these people they didn't particularly like. For whatever reason, they don't have the legal title to those homes. Israel in the 67 war wins back Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon HaTzadik, and all the people who had the legal title, they're like, okay, well, I guess you live there now. All the people who didn't have legal title, the people who were the previous landowners came with the legal title, and they said, okay, this is our land, we want our house back. And the Israeli courts came up with a solution, and their solution was, you can continue to live in the house, but you have to pay rent to the people who own the legal title, which frankly is not a bad solution. For 50 years, the Palestinians who are living there don't pay rent. For 50 years. So the heirs and assigns of these particular land titles decide, you know what, we actually would like to knock down these 4 houses, and we want to build an apartment complex there. This is what this whole thing is about, supposedly, which it isn't. It's just a normal real estate dispute over eviction and terms of rent and all of this. And an Israeli court finds, okay, well, they haven't paid rent, so they're going to be evicted. This is held up, right? The Israeli government says, we're not going to implement this right now. We want this to go all the way to the Supreme Court. It'll be adjudicated there. This is used as a pretext by the Palestinians to riot. It is used as a pretext by Hamas to fire rockets into the area. And the suggestion is this is Israel being aggressive and engaging in ethnic cleansing, which is weird because there are plenty of Arab families living in Sheikh Jarrah who are not being evicted because either A, they paid their rent, or B, they actually had the legal land titles to the homes in which they were living. East Jerusalem is still extremely heavily Arab. For a country that's being accused of ethnic cleansing, Israel is markedly incompetent at ethnic cleansing, considering that the population of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem has vastly and exponentially increased over the course of the last 50-odd years. Those are the pretexts for the conflict. The actual reason for the conflict is Abbas canceled the elections, he ramped up the violence, and Hamas, in competition, said, okay, well, if Fatah's going to ramp up the violence, we can't be left out, man. A party's a party. And so they start firing rockets into Israel at civilian centers. Now, Hamas does, because they're a terrorist group, is they put all of their rockets in civilian areas to try and stop Israel from attacking them, because they know that Israel actually cares about civilians, whereas they do not. A lot of the foreign aid that was being granted and given to Hamas was not being used for actual aid. It was not being used for electricity or water. Israel's been providing electricity and water to the Gaza Strip for free for years. Hamas didn't use any of this money to actually build up infrastructure or help people. They used it to build these giant terror tunnels and stock up on rockets. These rockets, by the way, being provided by the same Iranian government that the American government is currently attempting to negotiate with under Joe Biden, which makes no sense at all. It's also the reason why, by the way, why 200 Democrats just voted last week that they would not place sanctions on any company that was doing business with Hamas or donating money to Hamas. There's a bill in 2019, identical bill, said cut off funding to any company that does business with Hamas. It passed unanimously in the House. Now that Joe Biden is president and trying to negotiate with Iran, 200 Democrats voted it down and never saw the light of day in the House of Representatives. That is where things currently stand. Israel is attempting to do what it can to wipe out Hamas's capacity to fire rockets indiscriminately at its civilian population without having to actually do a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, because frankly, there are no good solutions there. If Israel goes in and wipes out Hamas, then maybe Islamic Jihad takes over, maybe Fatah takes over, maybe the next level of Hamas takes over. The only thing that has actually guaranteed peace in the region at all for any prolonged period of time was, in fact, Israeli troops on the ground staffing these areas, but Israel doesn't want to be there. And so the two alternatives historically have been Israel has to subject itself every few years to a barrage of rocket attacks, go in, knock out some infrastructure, you get a couple of years of peace, same thing happens in a couple of years, or you have to have a long-term quote-unquote occupation in which Israel basically attempts to pacify by keeping a certain baseline level of troops in a particular area. So, as you see, it took a very long time just for me to go through the basic history of this conflict, and that's the very basic history of this conflict. There's a lot more there. There are a lot of resources out there, but suffice it to say, the media members who try to boil this down to just a border dispute or try to suggest that this is just a matter of Benjamin Netanyahu, it's coming from ignorance and it's coming from stupidity. Do your reading before you bother to comment on the situation. One of the things that you will have noted in the news is that every time there's an uptick in the violence in this particular region that involves Israel, there's widespread anti-Semitic attacks that happen all over the world. You're seeing it happen right now every place from LA to New York to Europe. And there's this argument that's constantly made by people, particularly on the left. Well, if Israel didn't exist, wouldn't there be less anti-Semitism? Well, first of all, as we've talked about, you'd have to ignore every bit of history from 136 CE all the way to 1948 to get to that point. There's something quite ironic about somebody beating a Jew in the street over Israel saying, if Israel didn't exist, I would stop beating this Jew. The reality is that not every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, of course, just like not every criticism of the United States is anti-American. But every anti-Semite is anti-Israel. Every single one. And there's a heavy crossover between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism for sure.